Alright, stop the intro. I'm just gonna get right into this. I'm spoiling the question posed in the thumbnail rotten, but here we go. Super Mario 3D All-Stars is quite possibly one of the laziest re-releases I've ever seen in my entire life. It genuinely sucks that I have to say that, since I love this series and want it to succeed, but this one just isn't it. I don't say this out of malice towards these games. They're some of my favorites ever. If it seems like I'm getting critical throughout this video, and let's be frank, I definitely will be, it's not coming from a place of hatred, but of affection. Mario as a series means a lot to me, so when it screws up, I'm not gonna walk out on it. I'm gonna look it square in the eyes and tell it to get its shit together. That said, this isn't just about Mario. It's more than that. This is about a company and its profound douchebaggery. So I'm pretty sure you all know the story behind this one. The Nintendo Switch launches in 2017 and gets Super Mario Odyssey shortly afterwards. I made a near 50-minute review on that game. Go watch that if you need to, and thought it was really good overall in spite of some gripes I had with it. In general, things were looking up for Nintendo and the Mario series. They had just stopped ruthlessly revenue claiming and blocking YouTube videos that used their content that year, which is ultimately why I'm able to do this retrospective these days. And the future of Mario seemed brighter than ever. But this wouldn't last long. There were some warning signs that, just maybe, things weren't on as much of an upswing as they seemed. It all started with Super Mario Maker 2. I barely played it, only spending about a week on it, but at least from what I've heard, several aspects were downgraded from the Wii U game. I've never played that one, so I have no frame of reference, but it's hard to ignore what a large mass of people have said, you know. Also, need I even mention the online aspect? No, I don't think I have to. It seemed like Nintendo was starting to, I don't know how else to say it, take the path of least resistance for every one of their decisions. Which brings me to 3D All-Stars. This was an idea that I, along with many others, had several years before some of us even owned a Switch. Now, I'm not nearly arrogant enough to say I invented the idea. It's such a no-brainer that it's almost comical. As the Switch doesn't have a virtual console service, and back then N64, GameCube, and Wii re-releases seemed unlikely for Switch Online, many of us put two and two together. A remake collection, of course. It can be just like Mario All-Stars, but for the 3D games. They could update the graphics, get music with real instruments for 64 and Sunshine, put the extra stars and level design changes from 64DS into the original, and update the dated camera controls, add the cut content back into Sunshine with new secret stages unlocked with the blue coins, clean up the filler and gyro controls from the Galaxy Duo while adding more objectives that bring out those games to incredible strengths, and so on. They could even add extra playable characters to the games like the 64DS had, port over 3D Land and World, and have a version that includes Mario Odyssey a la All-Stars plus World. There were so many possibilities for this, what I referred to as Super Mario All-Stars 3D. Oh, would you look at that, I actually semi-predicted the name. Is what I would say if Scott the Woz didn't perfectly predict its name more than a year before me. Close enough. Point is, the idea had a lot of potential. It would be amazing to have these phenomenal games in one place on the latest system, complete with tweaks and changes made to realize their fullest potential. Best case scenario, the original versions would also be included alongside the updated ones, and you'd have one happy Mario enjoyer right here. However, I'm not one of them. I think I've made it clear already, but all that stuff I just mentioned, all those improvements and updates and such that they could have made, my oh my, how naive we all were. Looking back on how things played out, it seems almost crazy the kinds of things we in the Mario community thought would be done. I still remember the pre-release for this game. Through all the Animal Crossing controversies and nonsense that was going on, there was a leak. I remember the news like it was yesterday. In a future direct, a 3D Mario re-release collection would apparently be announced. It sounded a bit far-fetched, but the leaker was well known and had gotten several predictions correct before. Lo and behold, come September, the Mario 35th Anniversary Direct comes out and it gets announced. I couldn't believe it when I saw it, but shortly afterwards there were some things that seemed off-putting. The collection barely had any graphical updates. For God's sake, Mario 64 wasn't even in widescreen. Apparently it was also the Shindo version, infamous for patching BLJs and adding this unnecessary longer pole grab animation. But the worst part, it was a limited release, scheduled to be delisted in March the next year. I wanted to be excited about it, but the more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. Then it came. September 18th, 2020, launch day. Despite pre-release concerns, I and many others were cautiously optimistic. They'd make it worth the price of admission somehow, wouldn't they? I went to a local Target, asked them if they had the game, and purchased it for 60 big ones. When I got home, I put it in my recently bought Switch and proceeded to not play it for some reason. After all the problems I heard about it in the months following its release, no GameCube controller support for Sunshine, the camera inversion, and so on, it only made me want to pack the game up and forget it even existed. In fact, I haven't played the collection until now. If nothing else, that puts me in a unique position to discuss it. I was there for the hype cycle of this game, but haven't actually experienced the re-releases for myself until long after the hype died down. I've seen very little discussion about this collection ever since it was delisted, so I'm interested. Were people exaggerating? The game got a few updates here and there that fixed some of the problems people had, so how well is it doing on that front? What do I, a seasoned 3D Mario veteran, think about this collection? Well, I've already spoiled it. People weren't kidding. 3D All-Stars isn't just as lazy as everyone says, it actively downgrades the games from their original releases in some ways. It's not like Half-Life Source or unmodded SADX PC port bad, but getting there for sure. I'm sure you've heard this everywhere. It's also not like anyone will be buying this today, since it's mostly scummy eBay scalpers selling it, but I still want to talk about it because this series deserves so much better. As soon as you enter the main menu of this game, you'll see how barren it looks. There's no personality or charm to this, just a static list of the games and their soundtracks. That's it. No cool extras like concept art or pre-release videos. Nope, literally just the games, some brief text blurbs about them, and a music selection. Really justifying that $60 price tag now, aren't we? Especially since there's only 3 games, 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy. Not even Galaxy 2. Sure, doing that would make half the collection about the Galaxy sub-series, but come on. That's seriously preferable to that game being stuck on the Wii in the sub-HD resolution. Officially, I mean. Regardless, that shouldn't matter if the games themselves are at least on par with their original versions, but heh. Yeah, about that. Starting chronologically, Super Mario 64. This was the one game out of the 3 they've made the most accessible over the years. It was on Virtual Console ever since the Wii days, so it was only a matter of time before it got brought over to the Switch. And my god, they have absolutely butchered it. At the bare minimum, they just had to port the game without downgrading anything. I mean, it's a port of a 2-decade-old game to more modern, powerful hardware more than capable of running it, so the re-release should have absolutely nothing about it that can be considered even remotely inferior. But they couldn't even do that. This port has several downgrades from not just the PC port, but even the original N64 version. For one, I want you to see, or rather hear, the most obvious thing that stuck out to me as soon as I began the game. Take a listen to this shit. Yeah, you hear that? Sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? The game sounds like its audio is being played through speakers underwater or something. Like someone set the sample rate down really low in Audacity or some shit. And before you say it, no, it's not because this is an N64 game. The game did not originally sound like this. Not even on that original console. Did you hear how clear that was by comparison? I don't know how they screwed this up. I didn't change anything on my Switch, my OBS sample rate was set just fine, and I used the exact same setup that I use for recording any other Switch game. The only possible conclusion I can reach is that this port's audio was just that horribly botched. Not to mention, it's also delayed by what feels like half a second. The graphics have been equally bastardized. Yeah, the game's in HD, and in that sense it looks fine, but Jesus man, those graphical changes. I don't care for any of them, and for one, there's no widescreen, and the game is stuck as a tiny box in the center of the screen. I'm sure the lack of a border is bothering you right now, but that's the game. I had to stare at this, and now, so do you. At least the game isn't stretched, which would be actual pain, but would it really have been that difficult to give the game widescreen to fit in with the others? I mean, if some fans can do it with the PC port for free, then I don't see why a multi-million-dollar corporation with access to numerous development teams and countless resources can't. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. The real problem with this port's visuals boils down to 2 words: smooth pixels. All the game's HUD elements and textures are smoothed out, and put simply, it's bad. So do you remember those dreadful pixel smoothing filters from the NES, SNES emulators? Basically take that and apply it to the whole game. I know there's many people who really like this. To them I say, more power to you. I don't like what they've done here. It's kinda hard for me to put into words, but it makes the game look even more artificial in some way. I doubt that's even a good way to describe it. I mean, duh, of course it's artificial, it's a video game. But the way they change the visuals here just serves to call even more attention to that fact. Having these unnaturally high quality up-res textures and these old chunky models clashes and looks unnatural to me. That's why I prefer upscaling. That sharp pixel look will always be a lot more natural. The HUD is easily where it's the worst though. I mean, look at that. All the smoothed out sprites. Ugh, it's disgusting. I'll take the sharp, discrete pixels of yesteryear any day. Okay, but those are all the aesthetic aspects. None of that truly matters if the game plays well, right? For re-releases especially, presentation downgrades can really affect the game's aesthetic legacy, but I will agree that it's gameplay that ultimately matters the most. So how did this game fare in the porting process? It's a hefty mixed bag. I don't know exactly what it is, but something just feels so off about this game in this collection. I'm a person who's played Super Mario 64 a quite frankly unhealthy amount of times, so I'm pretty familiar with the game. I've always found the controls of this game very smooth, but here in 3D All-Stars, Mario feels like like he takes off ever so slightly faster. It's a subtle difference, but was enough to throw me off. His turning is also way worse, and it feels nigh impossible to run in a straight line. And no, it's not because the controller I used has no notches. I've played the PC port with a similar controller and had no such problem. So it's definitely something to do with this collection. Not quite sure what though. On top of all that, there's input delay. It's not as bad as if I were to plug an N64 composite or RF directly into a flat screen with game mode disabled, but even a few milliseconds can make a huge difference. It almost felt like Mario was wading through mud, a feeling I don't get from playing this game through the PC port or even the N64 original for that matter. Not bad enough that I would call the 3D All-Stars port unplayable, but noticeable enough to drive me nuts and make the game feel way more sluggish. It's things like this why I think this game continues to have such heavy backlash against its controls sometimes. Shitty port jobs like this affect the controls and make them come off as way worse than they originally were. This port is certainly playable. I was able to get through the game and finish it. It's not impossible to get used to, but compared to fan work we've seen, or even the original version, this is a downgrade in pretty much every way. It couldn't even reach 60 FPS, something fans are able to achieve no problem with Mario 64 Plus. Seems like Nintendo's getting beaten out by their fans in basically every way. So how did they react? By taking down the PC port and pretty much relegating it to a black market item, of course. What else did you expect? Hey Nintendo, newsflash for you, alright? If we actually provided legacy products on the Switch that were a better option than what you can get for free online, then maybe there wouldn't be so much of a quote-unquote black market in the first place. Have you ever considered that before? In the wise words of Gabe Newell, piracy is almost always a service problem. Hell, emulation through Project 64, which was first released in the mid-2000s and can apparently run on a fucking Pentium 3, is a better experience than the 3D All-Stars port. Even putting that aside, taking down fan projects or ROM sites is just scummy, especially if you aren't providing a superior alternative. No other way around that. It's not the 80s anymore. Some person releasing a fan project isn't going to make consumers become confused, cause money loss for you, and lead to another industry crash. So the fact you insist on taking down all fan projects is really infuriating, Nintendo. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the coldest takes you'll probably ever hear from me. But I'm getting into conclusion territory there. Let's hold off on that for now. Next is Super Mario Sunshine, the GameCube classic from 2002. I've had tons to say about this one since it's my favorite in the series after all. It's also never been re-released before this, with the only options to play it being on Dolphin or hunting down an original copy to play on GameCube or Wii. While Galaxy was also never re-released, it could be played on the Wii U by default, whereas you'd have to have a special soft mod called Nintendon't to play Sunshine on it. Or was it Nintendon't? I think that was what it was called, my bad. So as a result, the stakes are pretty high for this one in particular. If the re-release sucks, then that's detrimental to the game's legacy, as the remaster is automatically the most readily available version. It could lead people to believing the game was always like that, thus giving them a false impression of it. So how did the first ever re-release of Sunshine turn out? It pains me to say this, but any upgrades this port makes are matched by some pretty shocking downgrades. Not to the abysmal degree of the SM64 port, but enough to raise both of my eyebrows. For fairness' sake, I'll list the positives. The most obvious thing about it is, well, just look at it. Sunshine is a beautiful game that holds up wonderfully in the visuals department to this day. And this version hasn't looking the best it has on an official Nintendo platform at least. Sunshine now sports HD widescreen, an upgrade from the 4:3 aspect ratio of the original version. The cutscenes have also seen some cleaning up, although they're obviously still really low res since upscaling compressed video files will never be perfect, and they've been zoomed in on rather than re-rendered in widescreen. What, did they lose the source videos or something? I also really wish the graphics were updated, since you can get the same results in Dolphin alongside 60 FPS with gecko codes, but as is, this port at least doesn't downgrade anything major as far as graphics go. I also thought Mario's controls were translated to the Switch better than 64's. There's overall less input delay, and it feels close enough to the original version. Not to mention, they also didn't murder the sound quality in this port, and there wasn't nearly as much audio delay. If nothing else, this port is playable, and I still had fun, all things considered. I mean, it's Mario Sunshine, how could I not? That being said, this port also has some missed opportunities outside of upgrading the visuals, as well as several baffling downgrades from the original. For one, you're still unable to skip cutscenes. That was one of my few complaints with Sunshine, and a re-release could have easily addressed it, but they didn't do that. Dolphin has a gecko code that allows for this exact thing, and since this port is an emulation and is apparently itself using gecko codes, then why not implement this simple improvement? However, that's only the tip of the iceberg of this port's issues, much like Mario 64. Oh my lord, where do I begin? Well, how about the technical problems? Because this port has several. The original version had slight struggles with these kinds of things every now and then. I'll admit, Sunshine was never the most polished game in the world, but holy hell, this port makes that so much worse. For example, grabbing objects barely even functions anymore. This became especially irritating in the Gooper Blooper boss fight, where I could barely grab his tentacles after flattening them. It turned something that was effortless in the original into an exercise in patience. Also, wow did they fuck up blooper surfing. That shit was sick in the original, easily one of the most fun parts of it, but it was absolutely butchered here. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like the bloopers' speeds were drastically reduced and their turning was totally fucked up. It made red coins on the water in particular really frustrating, and it made it near impossible impossible to beat blooper surfing Safari in under 40 seconds, which I would have had to do if I played this port to full completion. These things were extremely easy on the original, but here it's just a pain in the ass. Side note, but it felt so cursed doing this game any percent for the first time ever. This truly does feel like a game that was meant to be fully completed. Anyways, back to the problems. I said that the controls were ported over fine, and yeah, this game is still overall fun to control, but I just mean that in the sense of the actual physics. Where this port goes wrong is in its control mappings, which are bafflingly off-putting. Part of it is probably me being used to playing this game on the original controller and button mappings, which I didn't use for this port because I don't own one of those controller adapters for Switch. I'm sure if I could play with the original controller, I'd be singing a different tune, but I still think it's valid to dislike how they've handled it here. Not everyone is gonna have one of those adapters. I mean, hell, I don't, so I'm in the same boat as a majority of people. Also because, like Mario 64, they fucked it beyond belief in the re-release. By default, the camera controls are inverted, which applies to both the horizontal camera and the vertical first-person aiming. Thankfully though, there's options to restore the original camera inversion in the menu, but that wasn't there at launch. By the way, I haven't mentioned it, but god does this control menu look bland. Yeah guys, let's just make it bland, characterless text. That'll make this collection feel like a real labor of love. Regardless, with the press of one button, you can change the camera to classic mode, which controls the same as the original. That's nice. Now, if only there weren't multiple unfixable fuck-ups alongside that. For one, the buttons are mapped so awkwardly. In the original game, first-person mode was on Y, while switching nozzles was on X. The GameCube's button layout is pretty distinct from many other traditional controllers, but its buttons can still be mapped onto the 4 standard buttons and feel relatively normal. On the Switch, the equivalent to the GameCube's X is the A button, while Y is in the same spot. By that logic, switching nozzles should be done with A, and first-person should be triggered with Y. So what does this port do? It makes Y switch nozzles, and makes A into a second jump button, and the only button you can talk to NPCs or select menu options with. First person mode, bafflingly, is mapped to R3, otherwise known as clicking in the right stick. Also, there's no option to remap these controls. You're stuck with them because fuck options, am I right? I can't begin to tell you how awkward it feels to have these control mappings. It's not impossible to get used to, but I wouldn't even have to get used to this inferior control mapping if they just had more control options, which I can't imagine would be very difficult to implement. But hey, control mappings are ultimately subjective. Ideally, none of these issues would even exist in the first place, but what I consider a huge downgrade from the original may not bother others, and that's totally fine. So then, allow me to talk about an objective flaw with this port. If the purpose of this port was to preserve the game, then this flaw completely undermines that goal. Again, if you use a GameCube controller, this isn't a problem, but for most people without that adapter, it will be. This port doesn't support analog triggers by default. I didn't mention it in my Sunshine review, but yeah, this game took advantage of the GameCube's analog triggers to a solid degree. You can slightly press down the trigger to spray while walking, or tap it to get a small burst of water, and don't always have to go at full blast. It's something I've pretty much always taken for granted, since it's essentially second nature for me. It's only when I played this port and didn't have it when I realized just how essential the feature was to the game. The lack of analog triggers made certain sections really annoying, and some it outright nearly broke entirely. The casino in Serena Beach immediately comes to mind, particularly the flip panel puzzle. I don't particularly care for this puzzle to begin with, because it's kinda jank, and not in a fun, oh I can totally get better at this kind of way. I mean in like an annoying and kinda tedious way. But in the original game it was at least somewhat possible to be precise with what panels you're spraying at by tapping the triggers only slightly. Doing so gave you small splashes that gave you more accuracy. In general, it felt like the player was in control. Here though, you're forced to spray at full blast, and with how much the water can splash in this game, and more often than not, flips a bunch of panels to the back to the question marks. This part goes from a kinda stupid but quick if you know what to do puzzle into an absolute nightmare. Yeah, it still didn't take me particularly long, but good god did it feel like it. That's easily the worst example, but there's plenty of other spots where it comes up. Again, I'm sure it would be okay if I had one of those controller adapters, but that's an extra 40 to 50 bucks right there. Even if I did have one, in this collection's 1.0 version, there wasn't even support for the GameCube controller at all. There were also visible debug cubes in the Secret of the Dirty Lake in that launch version as well. Figured I'd mention that. What an embarrassment. Like with Mario 64, I don't think this is a very good port, which really sucks. To this day, this is the most readily available, officially sold version of this game. So as I said, these downgrades are a detriment. I've seen negative takes on this game show up fairly recently, and almost all of them were based on this port. I mean, of course, how are people supposed to know any better? Your only other option is to emulate, which not everyone's computer can do reliably, or track down an original copy, which itself was most likely cost $60, alongside one of 2 old consoles that can cost several hundred. I already own Sunshine and the equipment necessary, even having a way to make the footage look really good to boot, but I'm not a regular sane member of society. For any normal person, they'd more than likely go for the Switch port because it's way more convenient. Well, at least they would before it was delisted, but I digress. Do I think this port of Sunshine tarnished the game's legacy to any degree? Honestly, Somewhat. It's not as bad as the Mario 64 port, but that's not saying much. As I can't seem to be able to stop reiterating, this game was stuck on old systems for so long. The fact it's the first official port of this game, and it turned out like this, how do you define the word disappointing? And finally, the last game on the collection is the 2007 Wii showstopper Super Mario Galaxy. Another game I had lots to say about in the original review, as well as another that had never been re-released. This one wasn't as in dire a state as Sunshine, as it could be played on the Wii U natively without any modification, like I said before, but you still needed to own it physically on Wii. In other words, not ideal. With how beloved this game is, you would expect it to get some sort of remaster or something, and it took until 2020. Sure took a while, didn't it? That must mean the port is really good, right? I've been really critical of this collection up to this point, but I do have to be fair. I honestly think Galaxy fared the overall best out of the three in terms of how it plays. But like the other games, it's far from perfect as a port. It takes some steps forward, but ultimately still comes up short from its potential. Graphically, it's fine. The resolution has again seen an increase from 480p to native HD. Galaxy was already in widescreen 60 FPS, so of course the port retains those attributes at least. All in all, it's the minimum standard you could expect from this, which is more than a bit irritating because this collection actually had effort put into it, then we could have gotten something better than the bare minimum. For God's sake, if you're able to obtain an ISO of the game somehow, you can run it through Dolphin and achieve the same results without even needing to purchase this overpriced collection. But hey, at least like Sunshine, they didn't totally butcher the sound quality. Seriously though, I can't get over how badly that was botched in the Mario 64 port. The aesthetics of this port are more or less acceptable, but again, disappointing. Really, what was preventing them from actually putting in at least a little effort in making even the most minimal of aesthetic upgrade? Alright. As for how Galaxy plays on this collection, well, it's complicated. I'd say it's overall the best as far as that goes. Unlike the other two ports, the controls don't have any input delay or any other such problems that can come from poor emulation. It could be because I'm admittedly way less familiar with Galaxy and how exactly it should feel than the other two because I've played it far less, but I'd still say I've played it enough to know that the 3D All-Stars port is more or less in line with the original's control and physics. The best part about this port, though, it actually improves some aspects of the game's controls. Mario Galaxy was originally a Wii game, and it has several painfully obvious reminders of that fact. The game got a new spin move, which was a really good move, but the only way to use it was to shake the Wii remote. It also made you grab star bits, use pole stars, and navigate the menus with pointer controls, which was always a huge pain because of how god-awful the pointer was. These things have seen refinement in the 3D All-Stars port. The spin move can be done by pressing the action button, making it far less cumbersome to pull off. Its pointer control is also way better. Now it actually works because of the Switch's superior gyro. It never once randomly disappeared on me, unlike the Wii where that bullshit happened constantly. It had an annoying tendency to get off center, requiring a press of the R button to recenter it, but I'll take that if it means more consistent functionality. All of that being said, there's still a quite frankly baffling amount of missed opportunities to improve the game. I personally thought Galaxy had the most potential for improvements in the pre-release. Okay, so they aren't doing full remakes. That's disappointing. But at least they'll do improvements X, Y, and Z, right? In my eyes, Galaxy is the most flawed of these three games, in retrospect, because I found it to be the overall messiest one, in spite of what these games' reputations suggest. I always liked the game, but thought there was numerous issues holding it back from reaching its full potential. The ideas it had are so good, many just needed better execution and a few tweaks and we'd be golden. This could have been a game I would replay it just as much as the others. However, what we got was some steps forward, matched by an immense stubbornness. On Switch, this game still uses motion controls. And no, they aren't optional. You're still forced to use them whether you like it or not. In case you don't remember, the forced motion control integration was high on my list of complaints. Periodically, Mario Galaxy had these levels that were entirely built around a motion control gimmick that, in my opinion, didn't work whatsoever. The motion controls were always inaccurate and felt calibrated wrong. These were only put in the game because of Wii, and have aged like milk. It wasn't the ideas that were bad though, and in concept these parts should have been fun. A re-release could have easily fixed that with one simple change. Make these sections controllable with a traditional controller. In fact, make the entire game that way. They had every reason to do that too, since the Switch had multiple control options. Keep the option to use motion controls for the purists, but for people like me who don't like motion controls, at least put in the option to use button controls. Guess what? They couldn't even do that much. Every set piece that used motion controls previously still forces you to use them, meaning there's pretty much no control options. If you have a cheap Pro controller like me that doesn't have gyro support, there's literally no other option than to use the Joy-Cons like a Wiimote and Nunchuck. By the way, fuck the Joy-Cons. Absolutely horrendous controllers. I'm pretty sure I've reached the inevitable point that their sticks started drifting, since more often than once, Mario ran in a direction when I held the exact opposite. This was particularly the case when I tried side flipping, where he would start running in a circle for no reason. Also, and this is the most stupid of them all, the menu still requires using the pointer. Why? It's a literal two-dimensional menu. What about adding buttons to that is so hard? Also, gotta love how Sunshine had no GameCube controller support at launch, so there was no way to use its analog trigger feature, and yet, when strict adherence to gameplay gameplay preservation would be a bad thing in the case of Galaxy's shitty motion controls, that's when they decide to suddenly change that standard. I don't get it. I do not understand Nintendo. Their business decisions make conspiracy theories look logical. Oh yeah, and the best part? I'd honestly say a lot of the motion controls feel even worse than they originally did. That makes no sense. If anything, the Joy-Cons have better motion capabilities than the Wiimote, so I couldn't tell you why it feels worse than the original. Because of this, I still can't be bothered to go for 100%. That was a huge sticking point in my original review, and was my primary reason for preferring the older games. And it has seen no improvement here. There's still the annoying comment system untouched from the original. I've already mentioned the motion controls, Super Luigi Galaxy still exists, and in general, full completion in this game is still as bloated as ever. I get it, I probably can't expect so much, and someone will probably tell me that changing too much would have made it a different game. I resent that notion. If you're gonna go through the effort of re-releasing a game, especially if it's bundled in a full-price product, then why wouldn't you go through even the most basic amount of work to improve the game to justify that price? It's not fair to just target Galaxy for this, I know. I feel this way about all three, but Galaxy especially. Like I said, I think this game had the most potential for improvement. In general, this port is overall fine. Like the other games, the graphics have seen very minimal upgrades, and most of the game's original problems are retained since it's pretty much a direct port. I also find it baffling that the terrible motion controls are still forced in the sections when they were originally used in, and even found them to be a little less responsive than they were on Wii. In contrast to the other two though, there's actually a few minor improvements from the Wii original. The most significant of those is the remapping of the spin move to a button. The pointer controls have also seen a gargantuan improvement, and actually worked properly all the time instead of just 50% of the time. This is a playable version of the game, and certainly functional. It's okay. But is that really the standard we've settled on? Okay, that's the best we're able to get from this current age of Nintendo? This is a collection of some of their flagship games. A few of the best games they've ever made. It was something many people were asking for years. By all rights, it should be something worth celebrating. A fantastic collection of classic 3D Mario games, some of which have never even been re-released before. But if you ask me, it wasn't. The collection wasn't just a disappointment, it was a letdown. And the worst part, it didn't need to be like this. It only released this way 3 bare-bones lazy emulations that in some cases make the games actively worse than their original releases, slapped together with a music player and sold for $60 because Nintendo knows they can get away with it. This is criminally underwhelming for a collection of that price. Doubly so since it was a limited release and gets sold at even higher prices nowadays, even long after it was delisted from the Switch eShop and pulled from retail stores. And really, that brings me to another reason I even decided to discuss this collection, even though it's 2 years old now and no longer available for sale. It's because, well, I'm quite frankly sick of Nintendo nowadays, and this gives me an excuse to talk about this. Not their actual games, I mean in a business sense. Nintendo is the epitome of great games, horrible business. They're able to conceal their dark side with a facade. Just because they made or published so many great games that have defined numerous childhoods, they basically get a free pass no matter how bullshit or heinous their business decisions get. It's been said that Nintendo doesn't even need to hire a PR department because their fan base will do a lot of the work for them. And it's all true. It doesn't matter what they do. Nintendo could cause a nuclear war tomorrow and start clubbing baby seals, and there would probably still be fans on Twitter that vehemently defend them. I'm not saying that these people aren't allowed to have an opinion, because hell, I have an opinion, nor am I saying they're bad people for thinking what they do. And look, I get it. It can be difficult to criticize something you love, especially from your childhood. That said, Nintendo has committed so many sins as a company, especially in recent years. I think part of it comes down to the Switch's immense financial success, but also because of a fundamental fear that was instilled in the company decades ago. I hinted at it once, but it all comes down to what happened back in the early 80s, the video game market crash. That was brought on by a flooded market caused by a lack of quality control and consumer confusion from all the different products available. Nintendo made it their life's mission to avoid this, which back then was the right move. Video games were a fledgling art form and the legality of the medium wasn't well defined. Many decades later though, the industry fundamentally evolved and changed. Development tools became more widely available, making the creation of fan projects far more accessible. Many companies, most notably id Software, did the unthinkable and actually released the source code for their games and the engines they used to encourage fan creativity. In fact, it was this openness that allowed Valve, one of the most influential developers, to essentially build their entire career based on a modified version of the Quake engine. Valve themselves would then go on to be one of the most consumer-friendly companies, often actively endorsing fan work, including a full remake of Half-Life in the Source engine, of which the entire goal was to outdo Valve's own bare-bones attempt at doing that same thing. To Nintendo, the term fan game is basically akin to speaking Voldemort's name. Upon seeing a high-profile fan project, Nintendo invariably resorts to their default response, issuing a DMCA claim and striking it down. They instantly enter a Winter Soldier episode, remembering the time the industry underwent the crash, even though it's not the goddamn 1980s anymore. We should be long past that point. Some teenager making a fan game in their free time isn't going to confuse consumers, it's not going to cause another goddamn market crash, which is something that this company just fails to grasp. They're a company that's stuck in the past. The same thing applies to emulation. If Nintendo actually provided a superior option to what you can do on your computer, maybe I could comprehend why they're so hostile towards emulators, but they don't do that. Hey Nintendo, if you want to get rid of emulation, then how about you give a reason for people not to do it in the first place? As I brought up with the Gabe Newell quote earlier, the reason why such a perceived black market exists is because, well, Nintendo just fucking sucks at providing legacy content these days. Put quite simply, they absolutely despise their fan base. It was no more evident in the absolute garbage they pulled on the community back in 2020. Oh yeah, I haven't forgotten about this. Remember when the Big House that year, the Smash Melee tournament, was cancelled because Nintendo issued a DMCA claim because it used Slippy, which itself was superior to their own online servers for Ultimate? It was 2020, people weren't able to go to conventions, so the only option they had, nuked. Completely taken down. When the Splatoon community showed their solidarity with the Melee community after its incident, guess what happened next? Nintendo canceled the Splatoon tournament they were hosting. Absolutely unbelievable. It's like we're back in high school or something. There's so many other examples like this. Nintendo sending claims to people on YouTube using their music and gameplay footage back in the Wii U era, nearly eliminating Melee's presence at EVO 2013 entirely, the total destruction of Emu Paradise, and so on. This stuff, as disjointed as it may seem, is all connected. It all feeds into the larger point I'm trying to make here. Nintendo is a company that hates its fans. They hate everyone. They hate me, and they hate you. And treats them like nothing but another dollar sign. Yeah, most companies are like that, but what makes Nintendo's case so frustrating in particular is the sentiment surrounding it. Companies like EA, Activision, and all that may be common targets, but Nintendo is probably one of the most underspoken, all because they don't put loot boxes and gambling in their games and whatnot. What strikes me as particularly infuriating is how Nintendo will strike down a fan project, whether a game or something like the Big House, offer a far worse option for an outlandish price, and then invariably waves of bootlickers will come and defend their actions. If any other company pulled this shit, they'd be burned at the stake. But since it's Nintendo, the company that defines so many childhoods, they seemingly get off scot-free. They're like the Disney of video games. Well, sorta. I don't know if that's a good comparison. It just came to mind. It's within their legal right. There's the 5 magic words. Put that shit on the bingo board. If you try to criticize Nintendo's actions, you'll often get something to that effect thrown at you. And you know what? I don't give a flying fuck if they're legally allowed to do what they do. The way they respond to fan projects is just scummy if you ask me. While yes, the legal system does allow them to do it, does that automatically make it right? Sure, yes, the legal system often doesn't give a shite about morality, but honestly, fuck the legal system. What Nintendo is doing is scummy, and no flimsy "they have the right to do it" defense can change that. God damn, man, I hope I'm not sounding like some douchebag right now. That's not what I'm trying to do. If you like Nintendo's games and that's it, then that's great. Hell, as I've made it clear, I love them as well, and this company's output was a huge part of my own childhood. But I like to believe I don't allow that to get in the way of seeing Nintendo as just another video game company, because that's what they are, a company. One that, despite what many believe, doesn't give a shit about you personally. Hell, I'd argue they actively hold contempt for their fan base, all because of the scummy trash they pulled on them. Even if that's not true, they sure do give off that impression. Ultimately, this all wraps back the 3D All-Stars because it's the epitome of what I've been hammering home in this unhinged rant. It's the culmination of everything wrong with Nintendo these days. In exchange for the excellent SM64 PC port, which they struck down on the grounds of copyright, we get this barely slapped together crap that's apparently worth $60 somehow. Jesus, the standards for this industry have been lowered so much that it's seen as a miracle they came out in this state. A miracle that they're functional. Have our standards really plummeted that much? Where this is acceptable when it's a bare-bones collection of only 3 games with no improvement whatsoever being sold at full AAA price? Forgive me if I seem a little disappointed, but seriously, I don't know when the bar of acceptability declines so much that we're willing to act like a collection like this isn't a cash grab. The worst part? The fact it was a limited release, which was only done to create a sense of artificial scarcity, an insidious way of driving up sales when it probably would have sold like gangbusters anyway. And when all is said and done, many will defend it with a myriad of excuses. But when someone else, no matter how reasonable, offers their own criticism of it, it's met with being told they aren't allowed to criticize the collection, either because said person bought it or didn't buy it. You can't win. As for the notion you aren't allowed to criticize something you bought, no. If that were the case, consumers wouldn't be able to get better products because there would be nothing motivating developers to improve their games. By that logic, you aren't allowed to complain about the slop they sell you at fast food restaurants you eat at, just because you bought their food. I'm sick and tired of Nintendo and other companies getting away with shit like this. If they want to keep my interest in this series, as well as their games in general, they had better adopt some higher standards and cut it out with all the legal bullshit. Basically, actually try to work with their community rather than belligerently pile drive them with scummy move after scummy move. I'm sorry if I sounded angry in this video, I've been trying to tone that down recently. I just couldn't help myself in this case. This collection irks me on a deeper level, and it's something that's been balling up inside me for years now. Hopefully Nintendo learns from this in the future and cleans up their act, but honestly, I doubt that. They're gonna be like this until the sun collapses in on itself, or the company goes defunct, or if they get new management or something, whatever comes first. That visceral, primal fear of a market crash is so deeply and fundamentally ingrained in how they operate themselves, so I'm not even sure if it's possible for them to change. As someone who's been invested in this company's games for nearly my entire life, it's disappointing to see them acting this way. That's about it for this collection. I don't ever want to speak about it in depth again, unless I'm using it as a brief example elsewhere for the sake of comparison. In any event, it's time to move on. Believe it or not, the retrospective is nearly over. Yeah, the nightmare is finally almost over. Alright, I'm kidding, but seriously, when I started doing this last year, I never thought it would take me this long to get through the series. I figured, yeah, I can totally get through all those games in a few months. Little did I know just how much of a commitment doing a large marathon like this is, especially with all the other crap I've been having going on. But anyway, as I said, I'm almost at the finish line. There's only a few more videos to do and one more game left to cover. It may seem odd, some may consider it a main series game, but if I covered the original Mario All-Stars as well as this, then I'd say it's fair game too. So if you'd like, be sure to stick around for my video on Bowser's Fury, the extra that was included with the Switch port of Mario 3D World, as well as the capstone to this entire marathon. That's all for me, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.
"3D All-Stars? More like 3D Ball Scars."